icons allow us then to encounter every time we're in prayer, whether it's in the liturgy. Each time we venerate the icons, they allow us to encounter a reality that is beyond ourselves. And perhaps that's why they're something that is so fascinating that they draw people to them. And so I look forward to learning from these blessed iconographers, who their icons have been before me, at least personally, both in my prayers at church or in my own personal prayers for many years. And so I've spent many years in astonishment and prayer before these icons. And so it's a real blessing to have them among us. I encourage you all to learn from them, as I will, and at the same time also to use this as an opportunity to maybe unlock an interest, to maybe begin thinking about encountering God through theology, through icons, through whatever it may be, of which, this session is one of the real key ways into it, but also through your own study, whether that may be in theology at St. Cyril's or otherwise. God bless you all, and I'll hand over now to Sam, who will introduce the roundtable members. God bless you.
Thank you, Father. All right. Well, good morning or good evening to everyone. I'm Samuel Caldas. I'm a lecturer at St. Cyril's. We're delighted to have so many of you with us from so many places all over the world. We'll jump right into it by introducing our panelists, our iconographers. So the way it's going to work is I'm going to give a quick bio of each and then invite them to show us an icon that they've painted, which is particularly meaningful to them and which they will use to tell us a little bit about what inspires their own work. So let's begin with Fadi Mikhail. Fadi is a graduate of the Slade School of Fine Art, University College London. He also studied under Professor Isaac Fanous, who is the founder of the Neo-Coptic School of Iconography, of whom we will hear a great deal later on today. His icons have been exhibited in the British Museum, the Royal College of Art, and Westminster Cathedral. Fadi, why don't you tell us about this icon?
Hello, Sam. Thank you. Truthfully, I chose this icon because it's always easy to talk about, or easiest to talk about the most recent icon that you've completed, if nothing else, because my memory is terrible. I'm going to talk about this icon. It's intended to be the icon of Christ dining at Matthew's house. It's sometimes termed as Christ eating with the sinners. But I chose to title it differently, at least when I display it on my website, because of what that kind of title brings to mind and brings up. And I think in today's society, we're always discovering how best to approach things that maybe are more sensitive than even our minds can handle. I especially like, and whether anyone here knows my work well enough recently, but I especially like pushing ideas around that involve and encourage discussion. If nothing else, this one, because there's a huge majority of green in the background, it is always a good talking point because people often misunderstand the color green in its use in contemporary iconography in the Coptic Church to only mean that which is evil. For some of the obvious reasons, we talk about green with envy, we talk about green like a serpent, and all those reasons. But of course, in early Coptic iconography, green also was used, depending on its context, for a life-giving color, for obvious reasons, again, to relate it to plant life and trees, etc. So there's that. I like seeing where colors can take our minds and encourage discussion. I also like the idea and the discussion around who gets to have a halo in an icon. Often you'll see an icon, for instance, of the raising of those from Hades, the Anastasis, and many people don't seem to have halos, and some do. And the question always arises: why does he get a halo, and why doesn't he get a halo? And I love that discussion of what exactly does a halo signify? Does it signify that we've understood this person to be canonized as a saint, or are we actually recognizing the saintliness of this person that we've always known and recognized anyway? Or are we recognizing simply the work of the Holy Spirit inside them? So I'd encourage anyone when they look at icons to have that discussion with themselves and others around them. I don't want to hold the table up too much, but those are some of the points that I've chosen to make about this icon that I've just recently finished.
Fantastic. Thanks so much, Fadi. All right, let's move on to George. George Makary studied fine arts at the Ontario College of Art and Design University, OCADU, and then art history at the University of Toronto. He also spent 11 years studying under disciples of the aforementioned Isaac Fanous. He's been commissioned to paint icons for and in churches all over the world, from Egypt to Europe, Asia, and even down here in Australia. George, why don't you tell us about this icon?
Thank you, Sam. This is an icon of the crucifixion that I painted this last spring. And it was painted to be used for a Good Friday service in one of the churches in Ottawa. And I particularly enjoyed playing with little things in this icon. I had a lot of fun with it, as you can tell by the colors. But there are little things that might be a bit unusual. So you see like a few rivers at the bottom of the icon. You see that there's all this vegetation and plants and almost a garden that's erupting from the foot of the cross. And even just like a few things with how I've rendered the two thieves, or including a gospel book in John's hand, are all small but meaningful opportunities, I think, to kind of explore how you can use an image to unpack what's happening with the cross and how the church views the cross. So instead of creating something that might focus on, maybe the death or agony of Christ, this kind of represents the cross as his throne. It represents this crucifixion as a moment of glory. And you can see that kind of like the garden and the four rivers, recall Eden, and that this is the new Eden, that this is the new paradise, that Christ is the new Adam. And you can even see next to the skull, there's like a fruit with teeth marks in it, like to suggest that it's almost as if the fruit had just dropped, and yet Christ has come in almost immediately beyond space and beyond time and entered into the reality of Adam and made it new and made it whole. And so this was just like I just like the way it turned out, to be honest. But it was interesting playing with little features like the gold, because this icon was made to be carried and processed throughout the church. And so I wanted to pay attention to how the icon would read in movement, and how it would read in someone's hands, and with certain hymns, and how do I convey like kind of the melancholy of Good Friday hymns with colors like purple and blue and bright spots of red that emerge out of all of that sadness. So I just thought this was a good example of taking approach to an icon that we see often.
Fantastic. Thanks so much, George. And last but not least, Kirollos Kilada. Kirollos is based in Mississauga in Ontario. He also studied at OCADU and is currently studying a Master of Theological Studies in Orthodox Christian Studies at Trinity College at the University of Toronto. His icons can be found in homes and churches in Canada, the US, Europe, and also Australia. Go for it, Kirollos.
Thank you, Sam. So this icon was commissioned by someone who, when he reached out to me, had said to me that he wanted an icon of a guardian angel. And it was because he had a friend or a relative, I can't remember, who was suffering from a particular illness. And this person felt that their guardian angel was always watching over and taking care of them. So I think what the person who commissioned it had in mind was, probably an icon of an angel, and, taking care of a particular person or things like that. But I wanted to see if the answer to this design problem could actually be found in tradition. And what immediately came to mind was this early wall painting from Bawit. This was discovered in the dig of, I think, Shasina. or Maspero. Anyways, the archaeology doesn't matter. And it's a totally unique depiction of an angel carrying the three youth. We have lots of examples of the iconography of the three youth in the furnace in Coptic tradition that survive. You can find it in the monastery of St. Anthony or in the monastery of El Sorian, or even on panels. And usually it's the depiction that people would expect of having the three youth there, and the angel is standing next to them in the furnace. But here, the angel is this larger than life giant figure who is carrying the three youth kind of in a little cloth or in the palm of his hand. And he's the one carrying them through that suffering. I can't find any depiction like this anywhere else in archaeology. So it's a beautiful example of a unique depiction in Coptic tradition that is creative, but at the same time, totally fitting with the experience that the church has of that narrative. And so, when we go to Midnight Praises as well, we sing about the three youth. And then the text that I chose is, "We follow you with our whole heart," which is the hymn that people know in Coptic as Tenoe and Sok. This idea that when God carries us through the suffering, that we then give our whole heart to him and follow him. And we experience that again on Bright Saturday as we sing that while processing all together through the church. So it was a beautiful answer to a modern design problem, but being resolved through something very, very old.
Amazing. Thank you so much, Kira, and to all of our panelists. So without further ado, let's jump into our actual discussion. So what we're going to do is now just proceed through a series of questions, beginning with the past of Coptic iconography, both ancient and more recent. And then we will transition into questions about the role and function of iconography in the contemporary world. So let's start with the ancient past. And I'll throw each question to one of our panelists, but they'll end up bouncing it around between them. So let me throw the first one to George. George, could you just start us off with the basics? What do we know about ancient Coptic iconography? And is there any sort of distinctive Coptic style that we can talk about?
That's very daunting as a question. Because the more I think the more we all study the past of Coptic iconography, the more we realize how little we know about it, and how huge of a world the iconography of the Copts must have been. And everything I think that's kind of passed down or made it to us is mostly fragmentary. And it's hard to understand these fragments without seeing them in the whole context. So if we get a small, like on the screen, you have this small icon of the three holy youth, in a panel, and we have no idea where it sat in the church. We have no idea, how it would have been used in the church. We have no idea what would have sat next to it. We have no idea what the church would have been named after, or if it was even in the church to begin with. And so you have all these questions that come up, and as iconographers, I think we enjoy looking at the technical aspect of these icons, and we enjoy using compositions, and we enjoy, all these little elements. But at the end of the day, we're left speechless when it comes to understanding who and how this thing may have been made, for the most part. And so overall, we know very little, but we're knowing more and more through excavations and through research work that's happening. And I think the field has been expanding over the last several decades, especially with technology. There have been some incredible advances in the way technology is being used to both access sites that are being uncovered in Egypt and to, put them into academic contexts for learning and to kind of take new approaches to understanding what an object is, what an image is, what a space is. And so all of this is slowly, as always, evolving, but at the end of the day, for the most part, there's very little we're going to know conclusively, which kind of makes things daunting and irritating and horrifying, but also makes things exciting and fun in terms of imagining, like what could have been, because history repeats itself very, very loudly. In terms of a style, like a distinct Coptic style, I think that's also a very complex question. And we try often to label and categorize things as Coptic, non-Coptic, Byzantine, non-Byzantine. And I think it's impossible to define something as purely Coptic from the bottom line. I don't think you can look at something and say this is 100% Coptic. And I don't think you can look at anything and say this is 100% this or 100% that. And I think as soon as you let go of the labels, there's a lot of freedom in how you experience the images that are in front of you. And as iconographers, we found a lot of freedom in dropping the labels because it's allowed us to kind of engage with other traditions and to engage with other approaches and to engage with, the contemporary world, the past world, the whatever world in, a much more liberating manner. And so there are some characteristics that you might find that are usually present within Coptic art, but that doesn't define it as Coptic art, I think. So you might have these very bold facial features, or you might have these, compositions where the main characters are larger than the rest of the figures. So kind of like this hierarchical scale that comes from Pharaonic art. And you'll find a lot of Pharaonic influences, but you'll also find a lot of Byzantine influences. You'll find a lot of Islamic influences. You'll find a lot of European influences. And I think once we stop looking at the word influence as a negative thing, we can start seeing it as decisions that the iconographers or the artists of these works are making. So the artist is choosing to be influenced by this thing. The artist is choosing to use this thing, from another tradition or from another approach in order to build the strength of what they're making. And so even between the three of us as iconographers, there's a lot of variety. You can't say that any of us is the face of what Coptic is or what a Coptic icon looks like, because even between the three of us, that's going to change as we work, and has been changing. And as you're going to see in the development of contemporary iconography with Fanous, even that changes, even his definition, his working understanding of what Coptic is actively changing year by year, decade by decade, icon by icon. And so at the end, we don't know. We have no idea. And that's the best part.
Can I jump in?
Of course.
Okay, there's a few things that I want to flesh out here because you're talking about stylistic consistency and you mentioned some of these features. I think when you look at all these different periods, there seems to be overall a clear boldness, and you use that word as well, a clear boldness of line and shape and color. So you don't see, despite the variety throughout Coptic history, you don't really see the kind of soft tones and rendering of clothing that you might find, say in the Northern Renaissance, or when we say boldness, there's like a simplicity that's there. It's a clear shape. If you put that next to what was going on in Constantinople, say in the Paleologan period, where there's a lot more elaborate drapery and things like that, there's a simplicity, I think, to the approach that the Copts have to painting. Even though it takes different forms, like you're saying, but maybe that could be considered like a kind of common spirit that unites all of these different periods. I also want to make a little disclaimer because you talked about influence, and I agree 100% that people should not view influence as a negative thing. But we often frame influences as kind of religious things. So we might say, oh, this is, here we have Byzantine influence, or here we have Islamic influence or Syriac influence or whatever it is. But Byzantine, a Byzantine stylistic element doesn't automatically mean Chalcedonian theology. In the same way that, a stylistic influence from the Arab or Islamic world or the Ottoman world doesn't automatically mean like Muslim ideas, right? Like when we look at the monastery of St. Anthony, we can say it has Ayyubid or Islamic influences. That just means that it's influenced by the art of that time. Same thing, when if someone says, oh, there's a bit of, Byzantine elements, that just means that it's part of the Greco-Roman world. And we're going to see the same, as you mentioned with Fanous, that, to use modern art or cubism doesn't mean atheism, right? So we have to separate the stylistic and artistic elements from some of those theological concerns sometimes. And I think that would be a useful thing to keep in mind for our listeners as we move on in this conversation.
That's very helpful. Yeah. Okay, let me move us on to the next question, which is for you, Kira. I suppose we've sort of touched on it already briefly, but how diverse is the ancient Coptic iconography that we have? How much variation of style and content and form do we have? And also, where does it come from? Is it mostly monastic? Are there any examples of urban church iconography that we still have? And are they different?
So I'll answer your second question first. Most of it is monastic because things are just better preserved in the desert. If you go and visit Old Cairo and get a little tour of like the Hanging Church, for example, you'll hear about how many times it was burnt down and rebuilt and then renovated and repainted. And so the city churches are a lot more dynamic. But there's a lot more preservation of early art in the monastic churches for that reason. So I'm sure there's a lot of beautiful iconography in the city churches of Egypt that we are never going to see and is lost to history. Now, that obviously, as George said, limits the scope or the view that we have of what Coptic tradition looks like, because we have only such a small sample. As George addressed, there's a variety in styles, and maybe there's some consistencies, but if you go to the monastery of El Sorian and you look at the works from the 8th century versus 10th century, and then 13th or 14th century in the same church, you'll see a marked difference. And then if you go and compare that to the 13th century frescoes in the monastery of St. Anthony, you'll see clear differences as well, but you'll see some consistencies. I think, and I've talked to an art historian about this, who agreed, Carl Ineme, who did all the work in Surian, that it seems like the main consistency for the Copts in iconography actually has to do with content. And it's the way that certain themes are approached that remains consistent throughout tradition more than style. You get themes like the nursing virgin or the inclusion of prophets, for example, in certain New Testament stories and things like that. And I'm sure there's going to be more to say about that throughout the rest of the panel. But those are my initial thoughts.
Fantastic. All right. Unless would anyone like to add anything about the ancient past before we move on to the contemporary period? Okay, well, let's then move to the more recent past. So anyone who is even vaguely familiar with Coptic iconography in the modern period will have heard the name Isaac Fanous. And even if people haven't heard his name, they've probably seen his work without knowing it. So Fadi, you studied with Professor Isaac Fanous. So why don't we invite you to tell us a little bit about who he was and what he achieved?
Okay, I'll give it a whirl. I would like to correct, though, truthfully, when you say that I studied with him, because there may either be people present in this panel visiting as listening guests, or there certainly are many others who studied with him for not just many months but many years. Notably, for instance, Dr. Stefan Rene or Dr. Girgis. Certainly, they are they're foremost among those who really had time with him. I actually only managed to spend a few months with him before I had to begin my time at university. But anyway, for those who maybe don't know who he is, I'll just briefly summarize that the late Professor Isaac Fanous, who he passed away about 20 years or so, he was the Coptic artist who was, I'll say, mostly responsible for developing the contemporary Coptic style that we use in today's church. Some of us prefer, I think, to say that he began the evolution of the contemporary Coptic style, since, frankly, it'll never stop developing as long as it's cared for. He was, as far as I understand, he was a brilliant artist who he began in Egypt, and he was eventually commissioned to paint churches in most of the countries abroad that the Copts had immigrated to. And roughly speaking, he worked between 1950 and about 2005, since he passed in 2007. So yeah, a career of about 55 years, an enormous, very prolific career. And yeah, all of us today who work in the Coptic style are inspired by his all the different eras of his career. George mentioned that there are so many different eras of his career. Every icon, every decade was massively different from the past, because he had a very admirable trait that he would just never stop studying, never stop experimenting, never stop trying to better everything he did, everything he said, everything he tried to do. So when you look at his very early work and compare it with his later work, the difference is very significant. He just never stopped experimenting. So that's the summary, Sam, for anyone who hasn't really touched on his name before. But if you'll permit me, the slightly longer history is that during his early career as a teacher, as far as we know, very little was practiced or even known about the Coptic style among the Coptic artists, because, well, there are probably many different reasons. One of them has been proposed that the church had very few, if in fact any, examples of the true Coptic iconography from the sort of medieval period until about the 18th century, when various tiny little schools and pockets of artistry popped up here and there, but there was no consistent style, as it were, to speak of. So it was actually Pope Kirollos, the late Pope Kirollos VI, who commissioned Fanous to sort of seek out and redevelop an authentic Coptic style that could be practiced and taught. And I'll invite George and Kira to jump in whenever they need to correct me on any of my chosen language for this. If we go to the next slide, Sabine, who's in, thank you. I've just put these 4 points in just to kind of cover what I understood, having spoken to many people who studied with him and from him as well, that when he was sort of commissioned by Pope Kirollos to go and seek out and try and develop this authentic style, these are, I'd say, 4 of the most important things that he would keep in mind. Number 1, ancient Egyptian art. Number 2, all the examples of Coptic art that were available to us, maybe from around the 4th to the 20th century. And again, please step in, Kira, George, if you know of anything that I'm saying that's not quite correct. Number 3, a contemporary understanding of iconography in modern day life and modern day practice. And I've put the name of Ouspensky there for those of you who aren't aware, because of course there were very few people teaching iconography, certainly not Coptic iconography at the time. Fanous had to go and to study with someone who was practicing iconography at the time. So he was actually sent to France where a famous theologian and iconographer, Leonid Uspensky, was teaching. This is Uspensky on the far right in his studio. And interestingly enough, if you look at Isaac's work, or Fanous's work, sorry, on the far left, it's sort of very, you have to forgive my terrible grammar, non-reminiscent or unreminiscent of contemporary understanding of his work, because it looks so, like, shall we say, not Coptic. It's certainly very Russian, if I might say that boldly. When you compare it to his teacher's work on the right, there's if nothing else, you can look at the colors used on Christ's clothing, which is something we don't often, if ever, use in the contemporary Coptic style, using blue and red, which is certainly a more shall we say, Byzantine trait. In fact, most of the time now, you'll know famously that Christ is usually depicted in white and red in the contemporary Coptic style. If we move to the next slide, Sabine, like I was saying in the fourth point in the previous slide, that he was constantly Fanous trying to follow in the footsteps of his teacher, where famously Leonid Uspensky in his book The Theology of the Icon said that an icon should always be painted or written in the visual language of its time, which is a mind-boggling statement to make. What does the visual language of our time look like? Certainly, firstly, that means the visual language is always changing, because with every generation, we adapt our tastes, even universally, to this or that. We prefer this in one generation to that. And if you look at this painting on the left by George Braque, part of the Cubist movement in the early 20th century, you see what they were trying to achieve, or one of the famous things they were trying to achieve was sort of to take a three-dimensional scene or even object and compress it into the flat plane of a painting into a two-dimensional plane or two-dimensional image, which is a very difficult thing to try and achieve. But the Cubists did it very well. And if you look at the painting on the right by Fanous, you'll see his Transfiguration mountains are the same. You know, what we understand to be a three-dimensional scene is compressed against the picture plane to try and achieve a very two-dimensional image. One, because that was a very Egyptian thing to do, if I might say. If you look at the ancient Egyptian paintings in the tombs that we're familiar with, it encourages, or certainly doesn't use, any idea of perspective. That was a much later addition to art history, and everything was flat and pressed against the picture plane. But that's not to say that Egyptian artists couldn't do it, because if you look at their sculpture, it was extremely convincing three-dimensionality. And if you look at the Fayum portraits, again, extremely convincing, very well painted three-dimensional paintings. But if you look at the more sort of well, I can't think of the imperial painting, as it were, that we see on the tombs. Everything is flat. You know, why did they choose to do that? There was something very timeless about it being flat. So iconography certainly had this flatness to it. If we move to the next slide, please, Sabine. If we compare these two images, I'm being very drastic here, but I think as contemporary iconographers have a particular fancy for Fanous's very early experimental work, especially when they were smaller. It seems that whenever he was painting or writing an icon that was particularly small, it seemed to excite him in such a way that he'd obviously make some experimentation both in shape and color and in line. And there is something very, if I might say, playful about the way that he approached and executed smaller icons, especially in the 60s and 70s, where it's certainly a very sort of hard, geometric, unforgiving line, very artistically enjoyable to look at, but not necessarily always pleasant. Because if you look at the right-hand side, there's a kind of a more ethereal softness, I would venture to say, about his much later work. And I think that would be an interesting point to bring up, because there's certainly a phenomenon where during his lifetime, and I'd say around the 60s and 70s, when he was commissioned to go and seek out and develop this new style, or rather a style that could be continued and taught about, there was quite a backlash, because the generation around him in Egypt especially were very used to Catholic imagery, which, you know, certainly came from European Renaissance and European naturalistic painting, where, you know, the bodies were very anatomically correct. They were rendered very beautifully. And there's something about iconography, especially imperial Egyptian iconography in the early centuries, way before even Jesus had come, that was almost unflattering anatomically. When you look at figures, they weren't particularly pretty to look at. The hands were anatomically enormous, but very gestural. And why? And I think there's a tradition that he was trying to approach and come to terms with and deliver so that it might be authentically Coptic. I think he probably, and as do we now, we're constantly battling with this question: what does an icon need to have to make it authentically Egyptian? If we're going to be clear about this is clearly an icon that belongs to the Coptic Church, this is clearly an icon that belongs to a different tradition or a different culture, and you step into a church and say, oh, clearly I'm in a Greek church or a Russian church or a Romanian church or a Coptic church. What are the elements there that are recognizably Egyptian? And of course, Isaac was trying to pull from ancient Egypt, and he was trying to pull from early Coptic, and he was trying to understand the modern visual language that people subscribe to. Trying to deal with all that was a very difficult thing, I'm sure, for any individual, but he conquered it so gracefully. And to deliver what he did to us by the year 2000 and have developed so many disciples was incredible. Sorry, I'm realizing that I'm really going into time here, Sam. You'll have to stop me when I've gone too far, but I'll just compare a few more of these. If you look at these icons of the Nativity, you can see the composition of the subject matter for Fanous changed very little actually during his career. There wasn't an enormous, I would say, an enormous amount of experimentation when he seemed to lock into a composition. However, interestingly enough, these two on the left, they're only separated by 2 or 3 years, and yet even they stylistically seem very different. One is really rather large and was in a church, and the other most probably was either an icon used in the feast, but was certainly very, very small, probably only not much larger than printer paper. And you can see the difference in playfulness again that I'm saying. He was a very hard-edged line. There was sort of a very unforgiving artistry about it. Even the way he approached the patterning on the floor is very experimental and might not please everyone visually. And if you look at again these theophany icons, even though the composition changes very little, there is certainly a softness, a pleasantness, some would say, about the far right. It doesn't, it doesn't have a universal appreciation for all of us. Some might say, actually, frankly, I prefer the far left. I like that gestural Egyptianness and that unforgiving woodenness about the hands. But the anatomy seemed to be more gracious and soft during his later period. And I think he was possibly responding to constant backlash by people around him saying, oh, this is far too geometric and far too ugly when you compare it to naturalistic painting, which is very, very beautiful and very elegant. Where's the elegance in this, Fanous? I really feel quite sorry for him that going through those decades of backlash must have been very difficult for him to hear. So whether he was succumbing to this backlash or he was sensitively appreciating the need to recognize that people's visual language was constantly changing is an interesting discussion to have. I think I've really gone over time now, Sam. You'll have to certainly move on before I swallow up all the time. But yes, Fanous, suffice it to say, was the person who really started it all for us. Of course, during his lifetime and especially early career, there were many other people also developing a style within the Coptic field, and they're very, very important to the field now as well, if not more and more, because we realize that Fanous seemed to have become the face of contemporary Coptic iconography, but he was just one major player, certainly the major player, but there were other players at hand as well that influence what we do today and how much experimentation we are at liberty to use.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Fadi. It's an incredibly important part of this story. We should move on, but I do want to ask if Kira or George want to add anything about the recent past before we jump into the more contemporary questions. Okay.
I think some of what I want to talk about is probably going to pop up in the next questions. So I think we can move on.
Okay, sure. All right, well then let's move into the present day, given what we've just seen about the rich and diverse tradition, both ancient and more recent, which developed in conversation with all sorts of influences, as you've all mentioned. Let's start to think now about the role that iconography plays in the life of the current contemporary Coptic Church. So I'll start with a question for you, Kiro. So we know that icons are not just aesthetic objects. They're not just pretty pictures to look at. They are functional. They serve a role in the lives of individual Christians and also in the life of church communities. So what might you say to get us started talking about how icons are supposed to be used, how they're supposed to function, perhaps in relation to church architecture or liturgy or theology? We can take it anywhere that you guys want.
I think we're often mistaken in thinking that icons are somehow self-contained. Like we want to hear about how much symbolism there is in an icon and how much meaning there is in the object itself. When actually most of the time, and I would argue for a lot of these ancient masterpieces as well, the images are given most of their meaning by their usage. Liturgy being the main usage, but you also have iconography that is funerary, for example, that appears in cemeteries or in places where venerating the dead is a particular concern. When you think also about the way that the liturgical cycle or like the church calendar is laid out, and the hymns that go along with that, you'll find that often we get the hymnography supporting and giving meaning to the iconography. So I think that's a good place to start.
Fadi or George, do you want to jump in there at all? Really good. Good. You must have said it very well, Kira.
He always does.
Let me then jump to you, George. So a bit more specific about the functional role of icons. So obviously the iconographic tradition that we've been speaking about has its origins geographically and culturally in Egypt, but as we've seen, it's been influenced by many of the other cultures and visual cultures that were around back then. But today, the Coptic Church is in a unique situation because there are Coptic church communities from Europe to Japan, all the way down to down here in Australia. So there are a multitude of different cultures which vary visually and in all sorts of other ways as well, in which the Coptic iconographic tradition is now being drawn on to serve church communities. So a really important question is what role iconography plays in evangelism and in bringing the Coptic Orthodox tradition to peoples who actually have no ethnic connection to the visual tradition that we're talking about. So let's talk a little bit now, and we can talk a bit more freeform here about how iconography interacts with cultures in new places. So George, do you have any general thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think a guiding principle for me in understanding how, iconography can be experienced in relation to people is that iconography is not the relationship that the icon calls for between the person and itself is not spectatorship or viewership, it's participation. So the icon doesn't call for you to just look at it. The icon calls for you to embody it and become it and participate in it and enact it. And so that's where it's really important to, build on Kiro's point that icons are not just separate objects. They're meant to function in harmony with something. And so with a question like this, it's responding to the lives of people, you know, but the lives of people are also responding to the icon.
George,
And so that
could you give us an example? Could you give us an example of an image that you find fits that bill? I think that's an amazing point, but I feel like people need an example, you know, subject matter and participation. Would you mind?
Yeah. Well, we could take the example of the icon on the screen, like the Ascension, for example. And Kiro can definitely talk better about this because he loves this icon. But the Ascension is, in our tradition, the icon that was put in the apse for almost the entirety of our iconographic tradition. It was only in the last 100 years or so that we stopped putting it in the apse. The apse being the wall behind the altar in the sanctuary. And so in that icon, you have kind of Christ ascending in the top register, and in the bottom register, you have Saint Mary with all the apostles. And when I point out that this icon is the Ascension, some people kind of get confused because they're like, well, Christ is shown as a child in Saint Mary's arms, so how is like the incarnation also being shown with the Ascension? And so this is where kind of the fun part of the icon's function comes in, because the icon doesn't necessarily respond to the same rules. It's, you know, it doesn't really play nice the way we want it to. It doesn't meet our expectations of how an image should function. The icon is usually violating the bounds of space and time. You know, it expands beyond that. It is beyond that because it's showing that that's where reality is. And so for an icon like this, the Ascension, you have that behind the altar. And it's not so, having said that it's beyond space and time, now we can read the icon of the Ascension as an icon of something even bigger. It's the Ascension as a reality. So here you have all the apostles and you have Saint Mary with Christ, and that is the entire church. And the whole church stands and sees Christ as he goes and ascends, but they also expectantly await his return as well. The icon is also an icon of the incarnation. You have Saint Mary, who carries Christ in her arms, which can be read as an icon of the Eucharist, because we're also called to carry Christ within us. And so the priest and the parish are facing Saint Mary, who carries the body of Christ within her, and we are called to be Saint Mary and carry the body of Christ within us. We are called to be like the apostles. We are called to be the church. Saint Mary is the church. The apostles are the church. It's an icon of the church, you know. It's an icon of Christ enthroned. And so Christ, you look at the icon of Christ enthroned, and the icon is saying, well, you're his throne, and Christ is to be enthroned within you. You know, and it shows you this spectacle of angels and glory and light. And it's like, this is what Christ resides in, but he also resides in you. And he's about to reside in you when you take communion. And that's the apex of what's happening right now in this liturgy, you know. And so all of this is happening just from the fact that we've put the icon of the Ascension in the apse, you know, and that's how it can speak to a person. And it just needs a little bit of us breaking the mold of how we usually understand art and how we usually understand the painting, to kind of extrapolate like a bigger picture. You know, the icon is always showing you a big picture, and we get tripped up on the little picture. It's like, yeah, but wasn't there like a mountain there? And why would you show Christ the child? You know, like, and that just kind of completely tears down any potential for how an icon could function in a grand scheme of things. And the grand scheme of things is kind of framed again in this building, in this liturgy, and by the people that are in that building, and by the people that are praying that liturgy. You know, and so you see how all the saints are kind of standing as a row. They're a large community that faces you. And you see all these angels in the top row, and they're all facing you. And so as a viewer, you're just looking at people. But as a participant, you are one of these angels. You are one of these apostles. You are one of these creatures. You are carrying the throne and beholding the throne and becoming the throne. And so these are all just different ways where, again, you look at an icon and it's calling for you to participate. It's calling for a response. And so, again, if you're looking at the icon as a tool or an instrument of prayer, well, prayer is a call and a response. It's a call from God, and it's a response to that divine call. And so the icon is prompting that. And again, I say responding to the icon, I don't actually mean responding to the piece of wood. I mean, responding to what that icon is conveying to you, the reality that the icon is trying to reveal to you. And like we were talking earlier about how the icon is not like a standalone object. The icon is configured by a lot of things around it that bring it to life. So you have music, you have the space, you have lighting, you have community, you have communal love, you have the body of Christ. These are all things that are, bringing the icon to life. And so that's why also when we were talking earlier about ancient icons, and I was like, we don't know what this panel did. We don't know whose life it changed and how, because we never saw it activated by all the things that it could have been surrounded by and all the people that could have been using it, But in this case, this is kind of a way where we can read an icon as a starting point for a relationship, or a call for a relationship, a call for an actual conversation. And so that's why you also like a nice characteristic. We were talking about characteristics of Coptic icons or Coptic art. I think if there is also one characteristic, it's how frontal all the figures are. They gaze into your soul, like they look right into you, sometimes even right past you. Like, they're looking, they're very confrontational, within Coptic art. And a big part of that is that, it's calling for a relationship, it's calling for a conversation. The first thing that you do when you're about to start a conversation with someone is look at them, And in the Gospels, there's a huge and very repetitive language of Christ looked at him, Christ saw her, Christ looked at them, Christ beheld them, Anytime he's about to do something, anytime he's about to perform something, anytime he's about to engage in a relationship with someone, he looks at them, he sees them. And so the icon is kind of showing with this frontality, with this face that's right in front of you, that Christ sees you, the saints see you. And so they're calling for a conversation with you. They're calling for a participation with you. And so that's just kind of been like a really big consideration, again, when it comes to how can an icon function in all these new contexts, new languages, new churches, new continents, new countries, new dioceses, new churches, new communities, new concerns, new needs. The underlying principle behind all of that is, how will the icon start a conversation? How will the icon spark a relationship through all of that? And that can change through style, that can change through color, that can change through composition, that can change through that can change through conversations with the priest or the board or the bishop of what might pastorally make the most sense. It will start with the conversations with the churchgoers themselves and the parishioners of, how can this impact me or enhance my liturgical and religious experience, overall.
I think there's an interesting thing here that we're always experiencing with church projects. There's kind of a tension or a balance between the universal or the general and the particular. So there is a tradition of iconography, and we can see it by taking a look at all of this history and things like that. Everything that was already presented, that consistency is there, as I said. But then you have the particular concerns of the church community that is going to be using these icons. And it's always a balancing act to try and make both work together. But even the relationship between, sorry, one sec. Even the relationship between the universal tradition and the concerns of the community, it's going to be different depending on what kind of community you're working with. So Isaac Fanous, for example, is working in Egypt at a time of nationalism. And that nationalism that's happening at the time of President Nasser and all this stuff affects Fanous's concern to make a purely Egyptian style. In his words, that's not going to be the same concern that we have now as we're working in the diaspora. And our understanding of what makes an icon Coptic is bound to change. But in the end, it should be in harmony with the liturgical practices and life of the church community.
This may not be an easy question, but how do we determine those boundaries? What makes something in continuity with the tradition?
So this is where I think the one who does iconography today needs to be very well steeped in all other aspects of Coptic church life. That means familiarity with the writings of the church fathers, with the seasons of the liturgical year, with liturgy in general. You know, if I'm painting an icon of a certain topic, what do our hymns say about that topic? And also an understanding of how the church reads and arranges scripture. One thing that's been really on my mind lately is the lectionary. And the lectionary, or the katamaras, the way that the readings are arranged in the Coptic church, is exactly in the same frame of mind as the way icons are arranged together as a program within a church space. Because you take different passages from scripture and different readings and put them together so that they reveal the meaning of each other, right? So if you don't understand and have an acquaintance with how the church does that, how the church lives its life in Christ, and perhaps even what makes that Coptic experience unique, you know, what makes Coptic liturgy unique, or things like that, you're not going to be able to make images that are in harmony with that experience. And that has nothing to do, by the way, because we were talking about, you know, new contexts in the West and stuff like that. That has nothing to do with like Coptic language or things like that. This has to do with, you know, the theological and spiritual flavor of the Coptic experience.
Yeah, really interesting. Let me like draw your back. And this is to all three or any of you. Back to the question then of specific, like when we are in new contexts, do you think there is a place for diversity in terms of how icons look in different cultures? I mean, should icons look different in Australia than they do in Egypt and so on? I mean, obviously there'll be still that continuity that you're talking about, Kira, but do you guys have any thoughts in general about how, or examples about how diversity can then play a role in sort of making iconography effective in different places?
George, I think this is really a question for you. I'd love to weigh in too, but would you mind telling us, George, about the project you're currently working on in Ottawa? I think that's very relevant to this question.
Yeah. So Ottawa is like a big project right now that kind of consists of different phases. So we're approaching different parts of the church in different ways. But the first kind of phase of that project was like the basement area, like a social kind of banquet hall that we have. And the parish priest wanted to start with that area for covering all the walls in iconography head to toe. And to be honest, when I started, I was kind of startled by like, you know, usually the priest wants to start with the church, or wants to start with, you know, something, but he wanted to start in kind of the social area, the common area with the iconography, and then move up into the church or the chapel or whatever was next. And his kind of reasoning for that, I think, was like part of it was the immediacy that the iconography will have in that space. And I saw and learned a lot and I'm continuing to see and learn a lot about how iconography can speak to people and speak to the life of the church by working outside the church area. Um, and so over the last, I think it's been maybe a year and a half or so, we've had maybe 95 different parish members coming in, and they're all participating in the active painting process of the iconography downstairs. And we've covered head to toe, beams, walls, every corner with icons and saints, and they all kind of relate to what's happening in that space. And so that space is kind of mainly an area where everybody eats, where we host dinners for the homeless, where we kind of do our services outside of liturgy. And so we wanted to show how the liturgy continues after liturgy in that space through iconography. And so you see in the everyday life, in the little things, in the small things, how, the life of the church, the life of the community is imitating what's happening on the walls. And so you have the feast in the house of Zacchaeus, the feast in the house of Matthew, you have the Last Supper, you have the feeding the 5,000, and they're all paralleling, like the feast that we're having in that space, and like the communal banquet that we're having together as a body. And so that's been really interesting to see, even for me, first and foremost, like that church changed my life and changed my perception of the church itself and the experience of the icon. And so as an output, my response was whatever iconography has been coming out now towards that church. And so you can kind of see like the life of the church, the life of the people using the icon. That's what completes the icon. That's what finishes the icon. That's what brings it to life. And so it only became so clear to me outside of the church context, because once we go into the church, then we start to have a little bit of a hesitation, and we start to be a little more conscious or conservative, or even more opaque with how accessible some of the aspects of iconography can be. It suddenly becomes something that's cut off and reserved, and we have to keep it this way, and all of that was kind of broken down. All of those barriers were kind of knocked down when we were working in a more common space. And so now that we are going up into the church, everyone has this kind of intimate relationship with how the image works and how the image expresses a core understanding of what's happening in the community itself. And so a lot of the images that were chosen and a lot of the understanding of what's going on in that space is also very unique to that parish, and very unique to the concerns of that parish, and unique to the ideals of what their goal is and what they find their role is to be in the broader scheme of the whole community itself in the city. Like, who are we as a parish, and what do we want people to know about Christ, and how does that extend into the iconography that we're choosing for the walls. But you can even see these kinds of this kind of decision making in little things. So it doesn't have to be in something as big as like choosing the themes or the program, but even when I had been traveling between like seeing churches in Rome and seeing churches in Egypt and seeing icons from this place, you'll see little things like artists in those times were depicting species of flowers and plants that are local to that area, or even animals that are local to that area. And so you'll see an icon, for example, of the Transfiguration, or a mosaic of the Transfiguration, and all the flowers and plants and landscape is local to that area. So it almost suggests that the Transfiguration is happening in that city in Italy, or that the Transfiguration is happening in that desert in Egypt, or that the Transfiguration is happening in Australia, or in Ottawa, or in Toronto, or in the UK, or wherever. So just the use of something that small has a massive implication.
I actually got a little funny story about that, Sam. I was just going to interject because I couldn't help but say it. We were actually working on a church in Florida, me and George recently, and we were making an image of what we'd hope to be a paradise, or the paradise. And I was very tempted, and I said to George, "Why don't we put some palm trees in there? Because the imagery of palm trees has such a symbolic meaning in iconography about the strength and the life and the longevity of them." And then I think it was George who said to me, we're in Florida, right? Because they have palm trees everywhere. Like, it's not paradise to them, man. They're just gonna be like, it's just another palm tree, dude. And so we didn't. But that kind of thing is very relevant. What are people experiencing around themselves? Is this paradise, or is just another palm tree? Do you so forgive me, George? I'm just going to cut in because one point that I think we're getting to, and we had planned to maybe discuss it briefly, is as how the conversation can sometimes about iconography tend to be quite insular, talking about iconography itself, and on occasions I think it's almost like, and you have to forgive me for being a little bit politically incorrect on occasions, but sometimes when you're in, like, say, a hymns class, we can get so caught up in the scale and learning the scale musically that we actually lose the focus of who is this about. I remember giving a talk once about iconography in a church, and one of my friends later, I said, "So what do you think? How did that go, Andrew?" And I was very self-conscious about the whole thing, and he said, "It was good, man, but you kind of forgot to talk about Jesus." and and I said, "Oh man, you're right. I did, didn't I? I just talked about iconography and the ins and outs of the technicalities of iconography and composition and all this." And we talk about how people respond to and how we respond to spaces and different parishes all over the world. And the question comes up, I suppose, and George and Kira have to forgive me for overusing this example over and over again, but when Jesus used parables, we have to ask ourselves, did he use different parables for different people, farmers or fishermen? Or are we to understand that the fact that he used parables blanket is in itself a visual language? We talk about trying to say, okay, well, I'd like to go into an Australian church or a church in Canada or a church in Japan, and I want to be able to recognize this as a Coptic church because the iconography looks Coptic. So, that might be akin to saying, right, I want to go in and listen to a parable because parable is therefore the visual language that Jesus used. But then you go to a different community, and actually he used a parable differently for a fisherman and different for this group of people who had a different field of work. And so I suppose we have to ask ourselves, like St. Paul, how Jewish do we become for the Jews? How Roman do we become for the Romans? And what does that look like? Is there really going to be, as we develop the style indefinitely over the next few generations, is there going to be more of an Australian Coptic style? Is there going to be more of a British Coptic style when we walk into the churches in these different countries? Or is that something to be very intentionally avoidant about? Should we make sure we're very intentional about being very consistently Coptic across the international scope? Because it would be nice. And a lot of people say to me, I really love going to a different country and to some random Coptic church and being like, I know that place. That looks like home because I recognize the iconography, because it looks very consistent with the iconography I see back home in a completely different country. I think to me, actually, that is a very strong thing. We acknowledge, especially in contemporary study in the field, that the more we know, the more we realize we don't know about exactly what the Coptic style is historically and moving forward. But I think we're also doing ourselves a bit of disservice, and we're being a little bit tentative unnecessarily, because there are things that are very recognizably Coptic. You bring in a Greek or a Russian or a Romanian painter into the room, and you show them 10 different icons from different cultures, and they say, "Yep, there's the Coptic one." And we could all do that. And there must be something to be said about that the boldness of the linear work is very inherently Egyptian because it comes so clearly from a pharaonic history, or the stature of the figures when they're only this high, when, for instance, a Romanian Orthodox figure would be this tall, more anatomically correct, 7 heads high, where a Coptic figure might, in most contemporary icons, be more like 4 or 5 heads high. There is something to be said about a recognizably Coptic icon. I think there is a strength about saying Jesus spoke in parables. He tried to convey the impossible to understand mysteries of heaven in very, very simple stories. And so I think it is very dangerous and very frequent, a frequent mistake of all of us in any field, to get so religiously caught up in the field that we forget what we're trying to do at the end of the day is convey the person of Jesus to everyone. How do we do that in its most simple, most digestible form, and yet also enjoy the mysteries that could be unraveled in the field itself. Iconography is very deliciously symbolic, and we could keep like compounding all the symbols in it, and every time you look at it, much like you read a verse or a chapter in any book of the Bible, you'd be like, oh, I learned something new today. That was amazing. I had no idea that that meant that, or that meant that, or the history of that is that, and that compounds the meaning. But at the end of the day, who was the person of Jesus? What was he trying to convey to us? What was he trying to give to us, to the Father? Have we conveyed it? Yes or no? Fail or success in an icon, in the image, in our actions, in what we do visually and otherwise. And I think it's very sobering when people who have nothing to do with the field of iconography just say that blankly to our face. Have you today, in this image, in this icon, in your action and behavior, conveyed the person of Jesus? Yes or no? And sometimes we have to put our hands on our faces and say, do you know, you're right. I didn't actually. I was so caught up in the painting, I didn't. And it's very sobering that happens personally to me sometimes. Can't speak for the other boys because, they're saints.
I have been finding that. Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
I'm sorry, after you.
No, I was just gonna say, like, I've been finding that sometimes also the context that we work in, or the whether it be the church or the church life or whatever, will naturally take us in directions that will push us to create work that responds to things. So for example, in Ottawa, like the church is in an Anglican building. And so the work that I made had to respond to the Anglican building. They had to respond to that kind of Gothic Romanesque style. And so I was making decisions and whatever. But there were also opportunities where, like, yes, I'm using a Romanesque or Western style of art to kind of, make the icon blend in a bit better with the space. But there's also decisions that I'm making that are showing that, yeah, at the end of the day, the icon is not, like Fadi was saying, like, it is about the life of Jesus and participating in the life of Jesus. So, and that showing that the people standing in front of the icon are participating in that life. So, in that apse, for example, in Ottawa, you have the figures of John and you have the figures of Isaiah. And I've dressed them both in the same way that the priest is dressed in front of the altar. One of them has the veil or the shamla, and the other has the lefeif or the two handkerchiefs in his hand. And so when the priest stands there, he's now the third person in the icon, participating in the icon, part of the icon. And I think ultimately what I need to remind myself of is the icon is there to tell you that you are the icon. Like the icon is there to tell you that you are called to live the life of the icon. And I always forget it, but the same thing happens with the hymns. Like the hymns are there to tell you, like, you are also supposed to walk out of church and be a hymn to everybody else who hasn't heard that hymn yet, or to your actions should sing the melody that you're learning, for this service, or and the language of that can change because the personality of everybody who takes on that role of being an icon can change. And so style can change as much as personality can. But these things always come in organically, they will come in organically if you let them. Like the decisions that you make artistically, but also just being inspired by, seeing such a beautiful church life, or such a beautiful relationship with Christ that the people might push you to make certain decisions in that icon. But I think we're always going to be in a constant push and pull between how much we can incorporate, the complex, and how much we have to incorporate the simple, because the reality is that, like, there is complexity in life. There is complexity in understanding God. There is complexity, but there also is simplicity. Like, there in the understanding of the person of Christ, and understanding the church, and understanding the life of Christ, and all of these things, there's always paradox. There's always paradox. There's always this, like, push and pull between two things. And Christ is ultimately the one who's always uniting these two things. Christ is the one who brings unity and harmony to two different things that may seem to be in opposition with each other. But at the end of the day, by putting the icon in Christ, maybe that's when we start to find, like, harmony between things that we think have disconjuncture, or things that cannot cooperate, or things that cannot be harmonized together. And so like I think it's always going to be. I was just reading like these writings by a great famous artist, Russian artist named Kandinsky. Um, and he's kind of, if you've seen his paintings, they're pretty abstract. But he's talking kind of about this thing of like history repeats itself and humans repeat themselves, and we're very predictable people, and there's this always going to be this cycle of like we try to be, you know, new and innovative and whatever, but at the end of the day we're still just going to end up repeating what our ancestors did, you know? Like we look at the things that the people preceding us did and we're like, that's old and outdated, let's redo this. And then the people who come after this are going to look at the stuff we did and be like, that's old and outdated, let's go back to the people who were working before them, you know? And so there's always this cycle. There's always this, maybe as iconographers, me, for example, I might think I'm like, oh, like, look, I did this new thing and whatever, and I changed the game. Some iconographer in the future is going to come after me and be like that was so dumb. Like, why did he do that? We should change that. We should fix that. We should correct that, you know? And then the iconographer after him will come and save the day and be like, George Makary had a point or something, you know? But like, it'll just be a cycle of you know, revisiting and recorrecting and you know, repeating. And so that's kind of why we find ourselves today looking at things from the ancient past and we're like, that has relevance, you know, there's something beautiful in that, but also like why we're also in this constant process of evolution and re-expressing things just in a different in new changing languages.
There's a liturgical theologian, David Fagerberg, who always makes a big point in his writing. Although, Sam, correct me if I'm wrong, I think this is not primary and secondary theology. I think that's Aidan Kavanaugh's idea. Anyways, okay. That's besides the point. He said he says that primary theology is the theology in the sense of the theologian is the one who prays. And secondary theology is everything that we might say in writing about that experience. So that the primary theology is the experience, not the talking. And iconography, I've been finding, works in a really great way to the point about speaking the language of the community and of the current culture, is that every now and then you paint an icon, and the way that people react to it is this kind of aha moment. You know, they look at something and go, yes, I recognize this. And what they recognize is that experience of primary theology, that theology of experience and that walk with God. I think most of what has been said by Fadi and George can be summarized in saying that instead of thinking of the icon as a window, we ought to think of it as a mirror. It reveals to us what we are and what we're called to be, and that imagery gets used by St. Paul as well. So that's the aspect of it's that primary theology that the icon is trying to depict visually, right? But then, you know, despite the fact that I think it was Lev Gillette who said that there are as many ways to salvation as there are people, the gospel also is one and the same. And so, as George pointed out, despite the difference in style, for example, between iconography in Egypt and iconography in Italy or Spain or wherever else, there's also a remarkable consistency in the approach and usage of these different themes. You know, the way that a particular story from the Old Testament might be used in churches, for example, is oddly consistent between Egypt and the rest of the Christian world, with these constant variations all across, but not variations in terms of like changing the subject matter completely. It's more like variations, the way that you have one scale in music, and that scale has variations where one element gets changed. And I think that's a useful way of thinking about all of this.
That's a really useful distinction, and ties in really well with what George was just saying about Christ at the center of iconography. Even if it's not icons directly of Christ, but Christ obviously is, and the reality of the incarnation is involved in the whole process of iconography. So that's a really helpful distinction there. All right, we're nearly out of time, so let me throw one final question to you, which is one that we all agreed was worth addressing. Is it possible to take iconography too seriously, to think of it in too magical or too rigid a way? How would you, as you know, from your experience of painting and speaking about and thinking about icons, how would you recommend we keep it in perspective and think of it in the right way?
We're all gonna die.
It's a great note to end on. Thanks, everybody. We'll see you.
This is actually a conversation that we three have quite frequently. There was an icon that I was working on recently with their help. They were helping design it. It was actually an apse in Los Angeles, and it was an icon of Christ enthroned, and behind him was the vine. He was kind of depicted as the true vine enthroned, and so above him was a banner held by two angels, and in it I wanted to put a verse that relates and ties things together. Now, it might be obvious to many to put a verse that relates to the vine, and that might just compound the whole meaning. Or some others might say, I don't know, that's a bit obvious. It's a bit shallow. You could do more with that. And famously, there's a British poet from years gone by called William Blake, and he used to write beautiful poetry. For instance, "Tiger, tiger, burning bright in the forests of the night." And he was also an illustrator. And next to the poem, you would think it's very obvious he's going to draw an illustration of a tiger, right? Because it relates to the poem. Or, like William Blake did, he would draw or make an illustration of something that seemingly didn't relate to it at all. But if you looked long enough and studied hard enough, you'd be like, oh, I get the parallel. He's trying to parallel man to the tiger. Oh, now I see. So we often, say, how can we add more meaning to the icon rather than keeping it just shallow and just say, well, it's an icon of Christ dining with people at Matthew's house, and the title shown on the icon is Christ dining with people at Matthew's house. Or we could say, I did not come into the world to condemn the world. The compounding of things is what can make something very, very exquisitely meaningful, or sometimes a bit shallow. What I'm getting at rather is, can we think of iconography and icons too seriously, and can we take them too seriously? I think where I was trying to say before is conveying the simplicity of the gospel. Jesus came to convey love, to love one another, and to love your God with all your heart. Is the simple message conveyed or not? Or have we what's the word? Have we delved too far into our own exquisite, delicious tastes, and just decided that we really want to compound this thing with so much meaning it becomes completely impossible for the average viewer to enjoy and understand it? My current failsafe is to show my wife, who will say, do you know what? I have no idea what you're trying to say in this icon. No idea at all. I can see that it's an icon of blah, but I have no idea why that's there, that's there, and that's where. And if she says the same thing after 15 minutes of looking at it, I say to myself, then I've gone way too far. I've gone way too William Blake on her. I need to pull it back, and I need to be more obvious. And the question that arises: who is our demographic? When we're making icons for the churches, are we trying to make it for the majority who are below the age of blah, or are we making it more for the academics who sometimes, if I'm being honest, insecurely we're trying to impress because it makes us feel good that we're being more academic with our work? And I'm a victim of that too. It's nice when someone who really knows their stuff goes, "Oh, I really see what you did there. Clever, clever. Or is it nicer when a 12-year-old or a 10-year-old goes, I love this icon. I really understand it. Thank you. Thank you. You know, that sometimes hits you better. And what, you know, what did Jesus mean when he said, you've got to become more like a child if you want to enter the kingdom? What was he getting at? Was he talking about childlike simplicity or childlike faith or childlike reliance on him? Or was he talking about just be simple? You know, this is what I want for you. This is what I want from you. And this is all you need. Or if you want to know more, go ahead and study more. But this is it. This is all. Anything else is a bit surplus. Sorry, a little bit of a rant there.
Would you, Kira and George, could you weigh in? Whatever order you like.
I'll tell you exactly how serious it is and how and the extent to which it doesn't matter. As George said, in no uncertain terms, that anything material, any material beauty that we create is in the end temporary. We might be tempted to be perfectionists and to create perfect icons. There is no perfect icon today. The perfect icon is what we are going to experience in the life of the age to come, as St. Paul said, seeing now in a mirror dimly, but then face to face, or St. John, you know, saying that we don't know, now we are children of God, but we don't know what we're going to be. All we know is that we're going to be like him, for we will see him as he is. People often have a tendency to overly mysticize icons and to attribute a mystical value to icons in themselves. Mystical experience is a grace that comes from God. It's not something that's achieved through something material. It's given by God, who gives it sometimes through icons, the way that that he gives that grace to humans through any other means. So in that sense, we shouldn't overemphasize a kind of mystical aspect or understanding to icons. But the icon, I think, plays the same role in our life in Christ as, let's say, the preaching of a sermon. And when we craft an icon and craft together that meaning and symbolism, the way that Fadi said, we're kind of in the same position as a priest who's putting together their Sunday sermon. Today, we live in a world of images. We're surrounded by images on our screens and all over the place. And these images affect our behavior. Anybody who's studied marketing knows how much you can influence or affect the behavior of somebody else through a good image. And so in the church, it matters what kind of images we use, not because they have mystical value in themselves, but because we need to think carefully about what kind of images we use to preach Christ and to experience him in liturgy, in the same way that we're careful about the way that we, render or compose our hymns or give a sermon or things like that. So it's key to our experience of God and the way that we learn about God through these images so carefully crafted with deep symbolism. But at the same time, we should remember that in the end, the icon is not perfect. The perfect icon is the Lord Jesus Christ. And these icons just give us an intimation or a suggestion of that glory that we have in Christ.
George, would you like to give us a concluding thought?
Yeah, on this same note, like I don't have a wife I can show my icons to, but I show my friends, and I show people in the parish over time, and I have been noticing that as long as I stay consistent to a pattern, people will pick up on the language that you're using. To the point where they kind of almost beat me to it. So like now I'll show my friends an icon and they'll be like, oh, like I see that you've related this thing to this thing, and that person's there because of this person. And like once I've done the work a few times, once I've created a pattern, people will understand that pattern. And I think that goes, that can apply to a lot of things that happens in the church. Sometimes we kind of want things just give it to me straight, like just tell me like min akhirha, like just tell me like what are you trying to say, Um, and sometimes it's frustrating because the church doesn't always do that. But sometimes, over time you start to discover that there's a beauty to that. I had a priest who I think he's sick of me at this point. But he was asking like, oh, you guys are like program and theme and like whatever. And what's the point of, like having a theme or a program or like, and so we kind of started having this conversation of like, well, the church has programs and themes and everything that it does, whether it be readings, whether it be hymns, whether it be the color of the curtains that it hangs, Sometimes we'll go from hanging black curtains to white curtains, to red curtains. And these are all little things that the church, and I'm sure there must have been more throughout history of different things. And that's because we also have, like the church has seasons, but we also have seasons in our own lives. And we see things differently and we recognize things differently based on where we are in our lives, and generations will understand different things differently. I will understand things differently 10 years ago to now to 10 years in the future, So something that we might think is straightforward now might not read as straightforward later, and vice versa. Something that's very complex for us now would have been very easy to understand maybe in the past and might be very easy to understand in the future. And so I think the language that we use when we're creating these things, ultimately responds to like the human experience that's happening now, the experience of becoming truly human. Like Christ is the realest human being, the truest human being. And so like he shows us what it is to become human, to be incarnate. And so he kind of gives that pattern first with his own life. He did a lot of things that we don't understand and that we're kind of like, okay, why is he being baptized? Why is he speaking to someone in the Garden of Gethsemane if he's God? Why is this? Why is that? Like there's all these questions that are not clear at all, but we understand it when we suffer with him or we go through an experience that's painful, and now we understand painful through his pain, or joy through his joy. He has seasons in his own life. He has patterns in his own life. These are all things that are, um, replicated or expressed as if by the church overall. So I think it's always just kind of finding that balance between like, yeah, how do we not overdo things, but how do we also not underdo things? How do we not shave off the glory that could, come from it, like facing hard questions and going head on into difficult conversations, or using art to tackle something that cannot be tackled with words or anything else. And I think that's something that's really valuable that the icon brings to the church, is that it gives us a new facet, a new opportunity, a new angle from which we can uncover things that cannot be uncovered by other means. And so that's why I personally get frustrated when people are like, iconography is not art. Iconography has nothing to do with art. Iconography has nothing to do with, like, but it is art. And that's what art does. Art shows us and reveals to us a reality about ourselves, because like Kiro was saying, it's a mirror. But it's a mirror that shows us that, Christ dwells within us, among us, and so how do we see him for who he is and what he is?
Wow, that's a beautiful point to end on. And it kind of brings us right back to where we started with the icon as, Christ is the original icon. Christ is the icon of, of God the Father, and then also of us as being drawn into the reality that's depicted in the icons. Obviously we could keep talking for ages, but I think we will have to maybe we'll have to do another session sometime. I'm going to throw over. So thank you so much to Kiro and Fadi and George for participating and helping to prepare. And thank you to all of our lovely participants as well for joining us today. I want to throw over quickly now to our community director, Sabine, to just make a few quick announcements.
Thanks, Sam. Thanks so much. And thank you again to our three panelists. I've just popped their websites on the screen. If anyone wants to go check out some more of their work, please support their work and have a look at it, and their social media pages as well. If you're interested in more panels like this, please let us know. Please send me an email. You would have got my email in the confirmation Eventbrite link. So please send me an email if you loved this panel, what you liked about it, what you want to see next time. If there's other topics, maybe liturgy or service or church architecture or church vestments, any kind of topic that you're interested in, that we can reach out to some panelists and get some experienced speakers to come and share their insights on those topics. We also have events at St. Cyril's that we run. So if you want to come along to those, please like our Instagram and Facebook pages. Also our subjects, we're running really cool intensives over the summer period. So we've got an intensive on youth service. So if you serve in that area of the church, that's going to be an awesome intensive. And then also a liturgy intensive. So if you're interested in learning more about the Coptic liturgy, in liturgical feasts, fasts, the Eucharistic liturgy, the offering of incense liturgy, all the different aspects of our liturgical life. That's going to be an awesome intensive we're running both in person and online. So stay tuned for that. And then, of course, our 2025 subjects, which are all online, you can find on our social media pages and website. Finally, the recording for this and all the resources will be posted as well. We have a podcast called Living Theology, which basically is trying to do what we did today, bringing theology, bringing church topics into our everyday life and experience. So check that out, and we'll definitely be posting this conversation on our podcast shortly. So hopefully you can connect with us in some way, and this is not the last time that we will be able to share the riches of our church with you guys online. So thank you so much for all that joined and gave up your Saturday morning to be here, and look forward to hearing from you.